Hello, this is Basil Nightingale. Welcome to Bill Russo's Short Story Theatre. We have for you today a tale with some truth in it, rooted in legend and myth. A yarn that is based on the first settlers, in what some people called, the New World. But that world was not new. For the people who lived in that New World, had existed there for 12,000 years, before being invaded by people with names like Winslow, Bradford, and Standish. So here now is Bill Russo's eerie tale that we call The Fifth Floor.
Like many veterans toward the end of the last century, Alex Forcer found himself adrift after completing 4 years of military service. The horror and the excitement of 2 Middle East tours had left him unsuited and unprepared to enter the workforce back in his hometown. He had just turned 18 when he volunteered for the Army, and now at 22, the prospect of spending 8 hours a day melting down metals to be crafted into jewelry did not appeal to him. There were, however, few other jobs available in the working-class factory town on the south coast of Massachusetts where he was raised. The truth is, he was much more comfortable with a weapon in his hand than a hammer, a screwdriver, or any other tool he might be required to use in one of the city's factories. The answer to his problem was located in the downtown tap on Main Street, at the bottom of a glass of beer. Actually, it was revealed after several glasses. Taken alongside his old high school pal, Jim Hannon, who was a foreman at the Silver City Ring and Bracelet Factory. Alex told Jim that he was considering re-enlisting because there was no way he could picture himself spending the rest of his life working at a bench assembling jewelry. Well, his friend told him about an opening for an armed guard at a local museum. He said that he knew the professor that ran the facility, and he offered to write a letter of recommendation. So early the next afternoon, Alex, with that letter in hand, left his room at the YMCA and walked to the museum, located on the 5th floor of the tallest structure in the city. Situated at the top of a steep hill in the very center of town, the imposing edifice looked like a combination of a monastery and a fort. Made of red brick, with swaths of white granite outlining the main entrance, and the rows of enormous windows, its aura was both welcoming and forbidding. Alex walked up to the front entrance of the building. Entering from the street through a set of automatic doors, Alex examined the first floor, which consisted of 3 things only: a newsstand, an elevator, and the bank. The lobby's signboard confirmed that the Jewelry City Bank and Trust Company filled most of the ground level. The studios and offices of the local radio station took up all of the 2nd floor. The 3rd level was Lawyer Row, being home to the city's most prestigious legal eagles. The 4th story was split between a restaurant, beauty salon, barbershop, and a few other businesses. The fifth floor, which was the top floor, was fully devoted to the Hockomock Preservation Society Museum, which the locals simply call the Hawk. Just as he finished reading the directory, the elevator door opened and about a half dozen people pushed out, after which he joined a handful of others and entered the elevator, which was large enough to carry about a dozen people at a time. The door closed noiselessly with a quiet hum. The lift went quickly up to the second floor, where 3 people got off and 4 more got on. Once again, the door closed silently and rapidly, and in a few seconds it opened at the 3rd level. 6 men, dressed in crisp lawyer suits, departed from the elevator, and nobody got on. The climb to the 4th floor was also silent and rapid. When the door opened at the 4th level, nobody got on, and everybody got off, except for Alex. The door began to edge forward as if preparing to close, but instead of shutting silently as it had for each of the other floors, it squealed and whined as if it were reluctant to proceed. Slowly, and squealing a protest, it finally closed. All noises stopped. There was no movement. After what seemed like a full minute, Alex heard creaking and squeaking sounds. With a shuddering jolt, the elevator grudgingly gained perhaps a foot or 2 before coming to a halt with a jarring bump that caught Alex off balance. Nearly falling to the floor, his plunge was stopped only by contact with the back wall of the elevator. With an ear-splitting grinding of old, rusty, unoiled cables, the lift resumed its perilous ascent. Alex had an image in his mind that beneath him, under the elevator floor, sparks were flying off from metal parts, grinding and pushing against one another. As the thing reluctantly resumed its strained journey, seconds later there was a loud bang from beneath the floor. It was a noise not unlike an explosion. This was soon followed by a series of vibrations that shook the cab of the horrible elevator before finally, with a parting thump, the door creaked open at the 5th floor. At first, he saw very little. He realized that there was no lobby, and that the lift emptied out directly into the museum. But the cavernous place, with a ceiling higher than 20 feet, was badly lit, and only gradually did he realize that the walls and many rows of shelves were overflowing with thousands and thousands of Native American artifacts. To his left, he saw a life-size diorama of an old New England Native American village depicting a scene of life of a race of people who lived more than 4,000 years ago. But for the fact that they did not move, the Indians, as Native Americans were called at the time, looked real. Gathered around a large teepee, they looked so lifelike, holding their spears and knives and bows and arrows, that Alex nearly reached for the .38 Special, which was nestled in his shoulder holster. As his eyes became accustomed to the dim illumination, Alex noticed that a wizened old man was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk that made him appear very small. The ancient, white-bearded figure with unkempt hair, almost as long as a yardstick, trailing down to the end of his back, was bent over a disorderly pile of correspondence. His cluttered desk overflowed with stacks of books and papers. There were a handful of cups and saucers and a large ceramic teapot. From his mouth dangled a massive curved pipe that belched smoke and flame. The bowl of the thing was so large that Alex imagined that the old guy could stick a saucepan on top of it and boil the water for his tea. "I've come about the armed guard job, sir." Speaking with a raspy voice that sounded like it belonged in the body of a middle-aged weightlifter instead of an 80-year-old pencil shifter, the professor responded. "Good. I have been expecting you. You will start tonight. Come back at midnight, and I will explain your duties." Alex replied that he would return at the appointed hour, as long as the elevator brought him safely from the 4th floor to the 5th floor. The disheveled old keeper of the museum responded by saying that the elevator was in splendid condition, and he had never heard any complaints about it. A few moments later, Alex was back on that scary elevator, and the trip from the 5th floor down to the 4th floor once again was a nightmare. Creaking noisily and reluctantly, the lift banged and rattled its way to the 4th floor. The door opened and 4 people got on the elevator. The door closed, and suddenly the elevator smoothly and quickly descended to the ground level with the smoothness of warm butter. When he returned to the museum that night to start his new job, Alex was reluctant to repeat his previous experience with that elevator. So he got off the lift at the 4th floor and walked up a set of winding, narrow stairs to reach the 5th floor. When he went into the museum, the old man, just as before, was seated at his desk, nearly buried under half-full cups of tea and mounds of books and papers, and further hidden from view by thick clouds of blue smoke that plumed up from that long, curved thing that dangled from his lips, which seemed more like a rubbish incinerator than a pipe. "Welcome to the museum, Mr. Forcer." "I was too busy this afternoon to properly introduce myself and explain your duties, so I shall do so now. I am Professor Welton Warren, formerly head of academics at the American University of the East Coast. What you see here are the fruits of my labors of more than 3/4 of a century, searching for and cataloging artifacts from the Native American people of this region, who lived here in what we call southeastern Massachusetts and Cape Cod for the last 12,000 years. Chief among my collection is the famous wampum belt of the Native Americans. It belonged to the chief sachem of the entire tribal nation. He was literally a king of kings. Dozens of smaller kings in Rhode Island, Cape Cod, and Massachusetts paid tribute to him, and that tribute was not just in respect or allegiance. That tribute was paid in gold, silver, and wampum. And wampum to the Native Americans was worth more, far more, than that legal tender issued by the colonies of the transplanted Europeans. And far more than just a belt, the wampum belt is a visual record of the people. Woven into the design of the belt are images and symbols which show the history of the tribe more clearly than could ever be illustrated in a printed book. That treasure is priceless. Many people would go so far as to murder to gain possession of the wampum belt. In this area, there is a rival historical group which have tried to take it from me many times, by methods both legal and illegal. Further, there is a large segment of the Native American community that believe the belt should not be here, but placed in their custody and brought to the reservation. Some of them are hot-headed enough to try to take the belt by force. Even the organized crime factions of Providence and Boston have tried to take this wampum belt from me. Before you start, I must warn you. Many armed guards have come before you and have all left. Some have been bribed to leave. Many were simply scared off. Some were found beaten senseless in the alley behind the museum. Others have been so frightened at things they have seen here that they have wound up as guests at the Taunton State Hospital for the Insane. Several have been driven off at gunpoint, but the wampum belt is still here, in this museum, on this very floor. Though I will not reveal its exact location to you, some people say that the spirits of the Native Americans, as depicted in my diorama, come alive after midnight and search for the belt, but they cannot find it. Your job, quite simply, is to turn away any persons who try to enter the museum after midnight. Your orders are to admit no one other than myself to the museum after midnight. After his discourse on the dangers of the job, the old fellow left, but not before informing Alex that he was required to punch a time clock at the top of every hour to prove that he was awake and on the job. Further, he was to make notations in a logbook. If nothing happened, he was to write simply "all quiet." But if there were intruders or anything else out of the ordinary, he was to write a full report in the log. Over the course of the next several years, every night, 7 nights a week at midnight, he reported for duty at the Hawk, as the local people call the museum. During that time, there were a number of incidents. A ragged group of old teachers and professors came in one night, armed with their canes and walking sticks, and demanded that Alex turn over the wampum belt. Alex was gentle with the old-timers. He did not introduce them to the .38 special resting in his shoulder holster. He just politely told them they were trespassing and they must leave, or he would summon the police. He was perhaps too gentle with the group because, just like flipping over a page in a printed calendar, they began showing up every single month. At midnight one morning, they trooped in with an extra large and noisy group. Alex was tolerant, but he finally had enough. He began walking towards them, and as he did so, he lifted his left arm toward the ceiling, revealing the black leather shoulder holster, which was home to his .38 special, a weapon which had served with lethal distinction during his time overseas in the military. He raised his right arm about halfway up his chest and closed his fist with his forefinger sticking out and pointing at the trusty old war gun. Well, that crusty bunch of old codgers beat a hasty retreat into the waiting elevator, and they never returned. But in future, some members of that group would be interviewed by newspaper reporters and announcers from the local radio station. Invariably, they responded that they indeed did become very frightened and made a hasty departure from the museum at that time, leaving as quickly as they were able to. But they said to a man that it was not the armed guard threatening them with his .38 special that made them leave. When pressed for more information, the old-timers refused to say exactly what it was that scared them off. There were other more serious efforts by groups and individuals to capture the wampum belt, but Alex withstood every attack and dutifully recorded each attempt in his logbook. He was never very fearful during the attempts by individuals or groups to steal the belt. He was simply doing his job. He easily handled every problem, acting almost on automatic pilot, using skills and tactics that had been sharpened to a fine point during his time in the military. He was, however, unsettled and almost scared by one thing. It was the big chief, the figure in the diorama. He stood tall, wore paint on his face, in full headdress, one arm raised high, and in the hand of the massive warrior was a genuine 17th century scalping knife. He looked so authentic and lifelike that he almost seemed to be a living being. But his looks alone could not shake Alex, but what did was the fact that the hulking figure was able to move. The guard of the museum knew it. He was certain of it. Because on the very first night on the job at midnight, that chief was directly in front of the opening to the teepee. But when Alex made his 1 o'clock punch at the time clock, the warrior was still motionless, but somehow he was now standing right next to the professor's desk. Over the next few years, the old professor spent less time working on the thick stack of paperwork on his desk and more time using that heap of papers as a pillow for his frequent naps. He would doze for an hour or so, then wake up, take a heart pill from a prescription bottle that was always close at hand. Then he'd shuffle papers for a minute or two and lay his head down on that pillow made of paperwork and begin a new nap. That would continue even as visitors to the museum came in and walked among his treasures. They were not allowed near the diorama of the Indian village. The collection of Native American figures surrounding a large teepee was now under the protection of a circular ring of chain link fence, the door of which was locked securely with a device that even a bolt cutter could not pierce. Professor Warren admitted that the treasure was hidden in a box inside the teepee, so he directed Alex to hire a crew to fabricate and erect the protection fence. And that came about after a series of attempts at the theft of the wampum belt. So with help from his pal Jim Hannon of the jewelry factory, Alex hired and directed a crew to design and fabricate the fence. Once the job was completed, the old Professor Welton Warren felt much more secure and at ease so that he could enjoy his long naps without fear of the wampum belt being purloined. Now, during this period, a new highway was being constructed at the edge of the city, which was designed to shorten the driving time to Boston for the people living in southeastern Massachusetts and the island of Cape Cod. Before work on the road could begin, it was decided that the route would have to be inspected by an expert to make sure that no Native American burial sites would be affected. This meant that every foot of every mile had to be walked on and examined by an expert. Being the most eminent authority on Native American culture in New England and probably the whole nation, the job fell to Professor Warren, despite his advanced age. For one full year, 365 days without stopping, the old professor spent every hour of daylight slogging along sections of the 5-mile route through the edge of the city. With a crew of 5 helpers manning picks and shovels, the old man excavated more than a dozen sites that were once Native American villages. Hundreds of artifacts were found, including weapons, jewelry, and many other items. 2 burial sites were uncovered, and it was decided that the highway would have to be detoured around them. To accomplish this was to add many hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of the roadway, but because the burial sites were sacred to the tribes of the area, it had to be done. After this work was finished, so was the old professor, literally. The last of his earthly energy was expended on that highway dig. On the night of that last day, he went to the museum as usual. At midnight, as usual, Alex reported for work. He found the old professor slumped over his desk. That was not unusual. But what was that his bottle of heart medicine had been knocked over. Pills were scattered all around the stack of papers that served as a pillow for the old boy's head. Alex picked up the phone from the desk and quickly summoned medical help. Slamming down the receiver, he shook the old man gently to try and wake him. Professor Warren opened his eyes and whispered, I'm sorry to tell you, Alex. Your job is finished. Your job is finished with my death, which will certainly be within a minute or two. Alex, go back to the army. It's where you belong. There will be no need for a guard at the museum now. No need for a guard at the museum. The wampum belt is safe. Alex tried to get the professor to explain, but his eyelids slowly closed, and with a last sigh, he took his final breath. Alex looked over at the diorama of the Native American village, which housed the teepee with the wampum belt inside, and the huge war-painted chief at the entrance to the wigwam. Instantly, he noticed that the chief was gone, disappeared. That massive statue, more than 7 feet tall, had vanished. But the lock on the chain link fence was still in place, untouched. Alex knew that something else would be missing too. The wampum belt. As he came to this realization, he saw that in the lifeless hand of the professor was a piece of paper. He took the paper. It was a note written in a childlike scrawl by the professor while he was being ravaged by the heart attack that proved fatal. The note had 9 words only. 9 words. It said, "The chief took the belt. It is safe now."
And so closes The Fifth Floor. Written by Bill Russo, the story is based on the famous wampum belt of a large Native American tribe that lived in an area that encompasses what is now called Cape Cod, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. The land was taken from them by European settlers, who nearly exterminated the whole tribe, in the King Philip War, one of the bloodiest conflicts ever to take place on American soil. Most of the blood was spilled by the Native Americans, who were thought to have been exterminated. But today, there are thousands of their descendants living in the region, and members of the tribe have recently banded together, to make a new wampum belt, to replace the original one that has been missing for centuries. The Fifth Floor is a production of Short Story Theatre. Our director and producer Bill Russo was the narrator. If you like us, please do so on social media and subscribe to our podcast, Short Story Theatre. This is Basil Nightingale. Thanks for listening and come back again, real soon. Won't you?